The cull pallets sat behind Northfield bulb traders in the gravel yard past the loading dock, stacked crates of saffron corms too small to meet the size grade the company's commercial buyers required for a guaranteed first-year bloom. Zara Kaul had been coming here for 5 mornings, not to buy. Northfield wasn't selling undersized stock, it was liquidating the whole warehouse before the building went to auction. But to check one crate at a time, the way a person checks something they are not yet ready to call a plan. She worked the same way each morning. She would lift a corm from the crate, press it firmly between her thumb and forefinger to feel for give, because a healthy corm held firm all the way through, while a rotting one yielded soft under pressure like old fruit. She would turn it over and look at the root plate on the underside for the telltale black or gray softness of basal rot, and every 10th corm or so, she would slice one open with a paring knife to check the flesh inside. Cream white and firm meant alive, and simply small, discolored and mushy meant compost. She had learned the test from her grandmother's letters, 11 of them, written between 1987 and 1994, that Zara had found in a shoebox in her mother's closet the winter after her mother's death. Letters her grandmother Ruxana had sent from Pampore in Kashmir, back when the family still owned land in the saffron fields there, before the unrest of the following decades made the crop too dangerous and too uncertain to keep farming. The warehouse manager, a heavy-set man named Denyose, who had worked for Northfield for 9 years and was mostly overseeing the liquidation now, had stopped asking why she came. He would nod at her from the dock and go back to inventorying equipment for the auction, and she would work through the cull pallets, testing, sorting the rotted from the merely undersized, marking the living corms with a strip of orange tape, and setting them into cardboard boxes in the back of her hatchback. She had reached the 9th pallet that Thursday morning in the thin gray light of late August, when Carl DeVries, who owned Northfield Bulb Traders, came out of the office trailer with his coffee and saw the boxes. Carl had run the wholesale bulb business for 19 years, saffron among a dozen other specialty crops he'd imported and distributed to commercial growers across 3 states, before a bad contract with an overseas supplier and 2 years of declining demand had put the company into liquidation. The corms on the cull pallets were undersized, under the 28-millimeter diameter threshold most commercial buyers required for a corm that would reliably flower its first autumn. And rather than sort and repackage 10,000 small corms individually for a market that mostly wanted guaranteed immediate bloom, Carl had scheduled them for the compost hauler at the end of the week. He looked at the boxes now, orange tape visible on every corm inside. He said, "Zara, what are you doing with those?" She said, "Testing them." He said, "Those are going to the compost hauler Saturday." She said, "I know. That's why I'm testing them first." Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. Zara Kaul had grown up in Brayton Falls, Vermont, the daughter of a mother who had emigrated from Kashmir at 19 and a father from 3 towns over, and had spent most of her childhood summers hearing about a saffron field in Pampore that she had never seen, and that no longer, in any practical sense, still belonged to her family. Her grandmother Ruxana had grown saffron on family land for over 30 years before political unrest made the fields too dangerous to work safely, and had written to Zara's mother for years afterward with detailed homesick descriptions of a crop she would never grow again. Zara had gone to college for environmental science, worked 8 years for the state agricultural extension office doing soil testing and crop consultation, and had been laid off 11 months earlier when a round of state budget cuts eliminated her position along with 4 others in the regional office. She had been picking up part-time consulting work, living in the house she'd inherited from her mother 2 years earlier on 6 acres outside Brayton Falls, and spending most evenings in a quiet she had not experienced since before the layoff, uncertain what to do with a professional life that had ended with 4 weeks' notice and a box of her desk belongings. The layoff had come the same month as the 2nd anniversary of her mother's death, and Zara had spent that winter doing the kind of aimless, half-productive household sorting a person does when they are not ready to sit still with their own thoughts. She had gone through her mother's closet 3 separate times over 2 years without finishing it, always stopping at the same shoebox on the top shelf, always telling herself she'd get to it eventually. She finally opened it in January, on an evening when the extension office's absence from her calendar had started to feel less like a gap and more like a permanent shape her life had taken. She had found her grandmother's letters that January, 11 of them in a shoebox, at the back of her mother's closet, most of it ordinary family correspondence, but 3 of the letters devoted almost entirely to a detailed description of how Ruxana's family had grown saffron in the Pampore fields. Corm selection, planting depth, the exact window each October when the crocus flowers opened at dawn and had to be handpicked before the sun got too high and wilted the delicate purple petals, and the painstaking work of separating the 3 crimson stigmas from each flower by hand over and over, because a single pound of dried saffron required something close to 70,000 individual flowers. She found the sentence that mattered in the last of the 3 letters, written in 1994, not long before communication between the 2 branches of the family had grown difficult. People here always said saffron was too particular a crop for anyone without generations of practice to grow well. I have come to believe this is mostly said by people who have never actually tried. A saffron corm does not care whose hands planted it. It cares whether the ground drains, whether the summer dormancy is dry enough, and whether someone is patient enough to wait through a year or 2 of small flowers before the corms multiply into something worth harvesting. Anyone willing to learn the actual requirements rather than repeat what they have always heard can grow it. I have taught 3 neighbors who were told the same thing I am telling you now. She read it 3 times. She had no way to ask her grandmother exactly what drainage specifications she'd used, or which cultivar, because Ruxana had died 4 years earlier, and the fields themselves no longer belonged to anyone in the family. What Zara had was the sentence: a saffron corm does not care whose hands planted it. She spent the rest of that winter and most of the spring reading everything she could find about saffron cultivation outside its traditional growing regions, not the general gardening material, which mostly treated saffron as a novelty bulb for a dozen backyard plants, but the harder agricultural extension research on small-scale commercial saffron production in non-traditional climates, including several university trials in the northeastern United States that had tested whether Crocus sativus could be grown reliably in New England's wetter, colder conditions. She read about the crop's actual requirements in detail: well-drained, sandy loam soil that would not sit wet through the crocus's critical summer dormancy period, because standing moisture during dormancy was what killed corms in wet climates, not cold winters, which the plant tolerated well below what most people assumed. She read about raised bed planting as the standard solution for exactly this problem in wetter regions, about planting depth and spacing, and about the multi-year corm bulking cycle, in which small corms planted one year produced daughter corms that grew larger every subsequent season, meaning a planting of undersized stock would simply take an extra year or two to reach full flowering size rather than never flowering at all. She read about corm rot specifically and at length because it was the one condition that would genuinely make a corm worthless, a soft, discolored, collapsing interior that meant fungal infection had already destroyed the tissue the plant needed to sprout, and she was not going to plant 6 acres of stock without knowing exactly how to tell a merely small corm from a genuinely dead one. She practiced the squeeze and slice test for 2 weeks on corms she bought from a small specialty supplier before she ever went to Northfield, cutting open a sample batch to compare firm, cream-colored interiors against ones she deliberately let rot in a damp paper bag until she trusted her own hands to make the call correctly. She was not going to guess. She had read and practiced for 3 months before she ever asked Carl DeVries if she could go through the cull pallets before Saturday. Carl had said, "Sure, help yourself," though privately he thought she was wasting a week on stock that had already failed the only test that mattered to his own buyers, which was size. The commercial market wanted guaranteed first-year bloom. Undersized corms didn't deliver that, and Carl had no reason to think anyone would want the extra weight. Zara tested 10,000 corms across 5 mornings, kneeling on the gravel with her paring knife and a folding table she'd brought from home, sorting rotted from viable. Of the 10,000, roughly 1,500 tested truly unsalvageable, soft, discolored, collapsing under the lightest pressure, genuinely finished. The remaining 8,500 tested firm and cream-colored inside every sample cut she checked, undersized for immediate commercial sale, but alive in every measurable way her research had taught her to check for. She wrote in the notebook she'd started keeping, a plain composition book she'd bought specifically for the project, because her grandmother's letters had made her want something of her own to write things down in. August 23rd, 10,000 rejected corms tested at Northfield. 500 confirmed rotted, no salvage. 8,500 test firm and viable, undersized for first-year commercial bloom, but structurally healthy. Grandmother wrote that a corm doesn't care whose hands planted it, only whether the ground drains and whether someone is patient. I intend to find out if she was right on ground 4,000 miles from where she learned it. Denny Ossie helped her load the last boxes into her hatchback that Friday afternoon, without being asked to and without Carl's full knowledge of the volume involved. Because Denny's own mother had grown a dozen saffron crocuses in pots on her apartment balcony for as long as Denny could remember, a detail he mentioned almost as an aside while helping stack boxes. Zara spent that same week building raised beds on her 6 acres, 3 feet wide and 8 inches deep, filled with a sandy, well-draining amendment mix she'd calculated from the extension research she'd spent the spring reading, positioned on the driest, best-sunned slope of the property where the soil would not sit wet through the crop's critical summer dormancy. She planted the 8,500 viable corms across 16 beds over the following 10 days, 4 inches deep and 4 inches apart, the way her grandmother's letter and the university trial data both specified, working from early morning until dark because the corms needed to be in the ground before the September planting window closed. Word of what Zara was doing reached the counter at the Brayton Falls General Store before she had finished planting the second bed. Denny had mentioned it, offhand, to a delivery driver named Roy Kessler who stopped by Northfield most mornings. Roy told Sandra Alt, who ran the register at the general store, that Zara Kaul had hauled off 10,000 rejected bulbs from Northfield's cull pile and was planting them across her whole property, trying to grow saffron in Vermont. Sandra said, "Saffron? That's a desert crop, isn't it? Spain? Someplace like that." Roy said, "That's what I thought too." "Doesn't seem like it'd take to this weather," Sandra said. "We get too much rain for something like that." Everybody knows that. The next customer, a farmer named Walt Bishop, who ran the dairy operation on the ridge above Zara's property and had watched 3 generations of Vermont crop experiments fail against the state's wet, unpredictable weather, had heard the same version by the time he reached the counter and added his own certainty to it. Walt said, "Saffron needs a dry summer to go dormant right. We don't get dry summers here, not reliably. She'll lose the whole planting to rot by next August." Sandra said, "That's what I figured." Walt said, "I've seen people try all kinds of things on ground that doesn't suit them. Lavender, wine grapes, you name it. Half of it fails inside 2 years." A younger farmhand standing nearby, who worked seasonally for Walt and had heard the story secondhand from someone at the feed distributor before he ever got to the general store, added his own version to the count. He said he'd heard it was closer to 20,000 bulbs, not 10, and that Zara had spent her entire severance from the extension office on the gamble. Sandra said that sounded about right, based on what she'd heard. Walt said he hadn't heard that part, but it wouldn't surprise him. By the following week, the story circulating at the general store and at the diner on Route 30 had settled into confident, near universal skepticism, inflated in scale and certainty well past anything Zara herself had said to anyone. What was accurate? Zara had planted roughly 10,000 rejected corms across her property. What had drifted? The number, the extent of her financial risk, and the certainty with which people repeated a claim about Vermont's climate that none of them had actually tested against the specific drainage conditions Zara had spent a winter researching and a week building. Walt Bishop drove down to the fence line at the edge of Zara's property on a Saturday in late September. Once the planted beds were visible from the road, mounded rows of raised soil running along the driest slope of the 6 acres. He said, "Zara, I heard you planted saffron out here." She said, 8,500 corms across 16 raised beds. He said, "This climate's too wet for it." "Everybody knows that," she said. "The climate's too wet for a corm sitting in standing water through summer dormancy. That's why I built raised beds with a sandy drainage mix on the driest slope on the property. I'm not planting it the way you'd plant it in a normal garden bed." He said, "You really think raised beds change the whole climate?" She said, "I think they change the one variable that actually kills saffron in wet regions, which is root rot from standing moisture during dormancy. The cold doesn't bother it. I read 3 university trials before I built a single bed." He looked at the raised rows a long moment, at a woman standing in work boots with a notebook tucked under her arm. He said, "I hope you're right for your sake. I've seen a lot of good intentions fail on ground that wasn't suited to them." He drove on and told the story at the diner that evening the way he'd seen it, which the room mostly received as reasonable doubt rather than genuine hope. Zara called the regional extension office herself the following week, the office she'd worked for until 11 months earlier, and asked a former colleague, a soil specialist named Priya Okonkwo, to come out and evaluate the drainage setup before the first hard frost. Priya drove out on a Wednesday in October, walked all 16 beds, took soil moisture readings at multiple depths, and reviewed the amendment ratios Zara had used. She said, "This is textbook drainage design for exactly the problem you're solving. Better than most of what I saw in the field when we still had a budget for site visits," Zara said. "I read every trial I could find before I built the first bed," Priya said. "I remember when the university ran that saffron trial 6 years ago, before the funding got cut along with half the program. The site failed, but it failed because they planted at grade in regular garden soil, not because the corms couldn't handle Vermont winters." She looked out over the 16 raised rows. She said, "For what it's worth, this looks like it might actually work where that trial didn't." Zara asked if she'd be willing to put that assessment in writing, in case anyone asked. Priya said she would, and did, and mentioned the visit herself, unprompted, at a county agricultural meeting that November, which Walt Bishop happened to attend for an unrelated agenda item. He did not say anything to Zara directly about it. His wife mentioned at church the following Sunday that Walt had gone quiet after the meeting and had spent an afternoon out on his own ridge with a shovel, checking drainage on a low, wet corner of his own property he'd written off years earlier without ever testing why it stayed wet. The corms bloomed the following October, 13 months after planting, purple crocus flowers opening at dawn across all 16 beds in a wave that was visible, Denny told her later, from the Northfield loading dock 2 miles away. Zara harvested every morning for 3 weeks, kneeling in the rows before sunrise with a basket, picking each flower before the sun got too high and the petals wilted, then separating the 3 crimson stigmas from each bloom by hand at her kitchen table late into the night, exactly the way her grandmother's letter had described, thread by thread, because there was no faster method that didn't damage the delicate threads. The work was slower than anything her extension job had ever asked of her. A good morning's picking yielded perhaps 2,000 flowers across the 16 beds, and each flower gave up only 3 threads, so thin they curled and stuck to her fingertips if she wasn't careful, requiring a kind of close, repetitive attention she hadn't used since she was a child helping her mother sort beans by hand. She worked at the kitchen table most nights until well past midnight, a small pile of crimson threads growing slowly in a shallow dish, while the rest of the house stayed dark and quiet around her. And she understood by the second week why her grandmother's letter had described the harvest less as a task and more as a season unto itself, one that consumed October the way lambing consumed a sheep farmer's spring. She dried the first harvest on screens in a spare room with a dehumidifier running around the clock, checking the threads daily for the specific brittle snap that meant they'd cured properly rather than gone soft with residual moisture, and weighed the finished product on a kitchen scale in early November. 14 ounces of dried saffron from a first-year bloom on corms that had been undersized rejects a little over a year earlier. She wrote the number in the notebook, next to her grandmother's line about a corm not caring whose hands planted it, and did the math on what 14 ounces represented against the 70,000 flowers her grandmother's letter said it took to produce a single pound, and understood, in a way she hadn't fully understood from reading alone, exactly how much of her own 2 months of pre-dawn mornings had gone into that one small jar. Walt Bishop drove down to the fence line again in late November, a season after he'd told her the climate would beat her by August. He said, "Zara." She said, "Walt?" He looked past her at the beds. Foliage dying back now after the bloom, the beds themselves showing no sign of the rot he'd predicted. He said, "I said you'd lose the whole planting to rot." She said, "You were working from what people generally say about this climate." I was working from 3 university trials and a letter my grandmother wrote in 1994. He said, "How much did you get off the first harvest?" She said, 14 ounces dried. He said, "What's that worth?" She said, "At the price the specialty market pays for real saffron, more than my old extension salary paid in 3 months." He didn't have much to say to that. He looked at the beds a while longer, then said his wife had always wanted to try growing something unusual on the low corner of their own property, and asked if Zara would be willing to look at the drainage sometime and tell her honestly whether it could work. She said she would. A chef named Marcus Reyes, who ran a small farm-to-table restaurant in Burlington and had been buying imported saffron at wholesale prices that fluctuated wildly depending on the season's harvest overseas, heard about Zara's crop from Priya Okonkwo, who mentioned it at a farmer's market where Marcus was sourcing other specialty ingredients. He drove out the following week, tasted a pinch of the dried saffron dissolved in warm water the way his training had taught him to evaluate it, and asked how much volume she expected going forward. He said, "This has more depth than most of what I've been getting through my importer. Fresher, clearly." She said, "It was dried 6 weeks ago, not shipped across an ocean first." He said, "What would a standing order look like if I wanted first option on your harvest?" She named a price close to what she'd researched specialty domestic saffron commanded, close to $40 a gram at retail for verified single-origin product, and he agreed to it without negotiating hard, said he knew 2 other chefs in Burlington who'd want in once word got out, because domestic saffron with a documented growing story was rare enough to be worth featuring on a menu by name. Her nephew, 10 years old and living 2 towns over, had taken to helping most weekend mornings that second fall, kneeling in the rows before sunrise learning to pick blooms the careful way his aunt had learned from a letter, and had come to the fence one Sunday before the second harvest with a question asked the way children ask things, without any preamble at all. He said, "Why do the flowers only open in the morning? My mom says you have to pick them really early." Zara crouched at the edge of the bed. She said, "They start to close and wilt once the sun gets too warm. So if you wait, you lose the color and some of what makes it worth anything." My grandmother used to get up before dawn every October to catch them at exactly the right moment in a field on the other side of the world. "I do the same thing now, here," he said. "How did you know it would grow here? Everyone said it wouldn't." She said, "My grandmother wrote a letter in 1994, 30 years before I needed to read it, saying the ground doesn't care whose hands planted it, only whether it drains right." I just had to be patient enough to test whether she was right. He thought about this. He said, "It's really purple." Zara looked down the row, the beds fully in bloom again for the second season, purple flowers open in the early light. She said, "Yes, it is." That night, after her nephew had gone home and the beds had gone quiet under an October evening, Zara sat at the kitchen table with the notebook, now in its second volume, and wrote the entry the way she wrote every entry, without embellishment. October, second season. 16 beds, full bloom. 3 restaurant contracts signed, more inquiries pending. First harvest yield 14 ounces. Second harvest projected near double as corms bulk up. Cost of the original 10,000 corms. Nothing. Cost of the year it took to prove the climate wrong. Everything I had left after the layoff. She read the line back to herself. Then she wrote one more. Started with 10,000 corms everyone said were too small and too far from home to ever bloom here. 500 were alive. The ground never once asked whose hands planted them. She closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside the shoebox of her grandmother's letters, the place in the house where things got kept for whoever came next. Then she went out to check the last row before the light faded. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told that where they are isn't the right place for what they're trying to grow. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever proven an entire climate or an entire room of people wrong about something you were patient enough to test, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.